This is an album that divides Floyd fans, many arguing that it's nothing more than a pale imitation of that classic 70s band. Even the Toronto Star's Greg Quill describes it as mundane and predictable. But the question we've got to ask ourselves is it really that bad? The writer Herman Melville said it's better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation. And this record was certainly a success, despite, in the words of Roger Waters, being nothing more than a forgery. Nevertheless, the battle raged on, or as Waters might term it, the cattle grazed on, using his animals analogy. Nevertheless, over the years it's left many torn as to where this album should feature in the Floyd canon. One turned unceremoniously fired at Waters, it has to be said. There are those that insist that Pink Floyd, without its conceptual genius Roger Waters, is not really Pink Floyd at all. And this informs their dislike of this record, a record that Waters has gone on to describe as mediocre. Mediocre or not, the success this band achieved with this album, and of course the subsequent tour, boiled his piss somewhat. Many critics of this record, myself included, argue this album lacks warmth. It lacks that element, that timeless quality, that element of Floydishness that makes this band what they were. That melding of those grand conceptual suites and remarkable lyrics by Waters with the musical orthodoxy brought to the table by Gilmour, Wright and Mason. I am talking about the 1987 version of this album. Do stick around to the end though, where we turn our attentions to the 2019 remix. But therein lies the problem with this album. It feels too much like an exploration of the technological topography that was available at the time and lacks that timeless grace that Pink Floyd's music always had. And Gilmour acknowledges that. He identifies even as far back as 1994 there was an appetite to remix this album, to give it that aforementioned timeless quality, rather than a mulleted and chinoed Floyd anchored to the sonic whims and affectations of the 1980s. Many critics praised this album initially, welcomed the return to a more music-orientated Floyd away from the rather turgid albums like The Final Cut. Sounds wrote that with this album we're back over the wall to where diamonds are crazy, moons have dark sides and mothers have atom hearts. Identifying that clear division between Waters' megalomaniac phase and the Floyd that came before it. And this record lacks that bristle and tautness and that strangulated bark that Waters brings to the table. Nevertheless, there are elements of Floydishness that tend to be overlooked at times, I think, when discussing the very identity of this band. For example, the spatial, ethereal quality of Gilmour's guitar, the fluid and languid drum style of Nick Mason, and not to forget, of course, the wonderful textures and ambience added by Richard Wright's keyboard parts formed by classical and jazz influences. These elements bring a grace and soaring quality to this music. Ironically, seem to be rather absent from this album as well to a certain extent. At a point when you think they'd want to sound more like Pink Floyd than ever, we serve this dish of heavily processed 80s pottage where the vocals at times are buried. There's some very unright keyboard parts and Nick Mason, and not to mention those horrible electronic drum parts. Nevertheless, it's a chilly album that lacks that specific atmosphere we were all looking for. And at the risk of repeating myself, it's those horrible 1980s production values that make, I think, the original album virtually unlistenable to me these days. And of course, the band are at loggerheads with Waters' lawyers, who Waters was insisting this band had no right to exist without him. And there's no doubt, despite the comments that were tossed to and fro in the music press, there's no doubt that Waters felt betrayed. And doubly betrayed, I suspect, by Bob Ezrin's involvement in the project. I read somewhere that Gilmour and Ezrin actually composed a song about Roger Waters, or for Roger Waters, called Peace Be With You. And that would make us interesting to listen. Gilmour admits they struggled to find any kind of conceptual arc for this record, instead choosing to just produce 10 songs to poke Roger with. And various titles were titles like Signs of Life, Broken Promises, Delusion and Maturity. I read somewhere that Bob Ezrin had suggested to Gilmour that they try to embed some contemporary, more urban sounds into the mix of this record. Thank heavens they didn't go there. It is, of course, well documented that Waters tends to privilege lyrics and concept over music and a damn good tune. However, this tends to make, I think, some of his solo stuff a bit of a trudge, to say the least. For me, music hits us at an emotional level, lyrics more at an intellectual level, and Floyd at the very best were a melding of the two. If there are any conceptual nibbles to be gleaned from this album, one could perhaps argue that it's about a world that lacks humanity, one in which we act in the absence of what is rational or reasonable. Waters describes this album as a clever forgery and Gilmour's lyrics as third-rate. If I listen to the original album, I must admit, I think Learning to Fly is not great in my opinion. It sounds like something Mike and the Mechanics would have done. Dogs of War is atrocious. It's a kind of a lazy, bluesy dirge built around an overused and tired metaphor. One Slip is a little bit poppy for my taste. I do like Sorrow. I first heard Sorrow on the Tommy Vance Friday Rock Show. I thought the guitar at the start was just fantastic. I have to say, though, Yet Another Movie is one of my favourite Floyd numbers. I think it's a remarkably good number that would certainly menace my top 10 Floyd songs of all time. It was actually a song that Gilmour presented to Waters, I think during the Final Cut sessions, but Waters rejected it. Phil Sutcliffe, writing for Q Magazine, described the two-part A New Machine as a chillingly beautiful vocal exploration and a brilliant stroke of the imagination. The original mix of this album is a Gilmour album. To be honest with you, I don't think there's hardly anything on it from Wright and Mason. Instead, there was a preference for session musicians, especially during the LA sessions. Nick Mason, in his autobiography, says he was intimidated by the technology and felt so anxious that it was important that they get this album just right. It had to be perfect due to the pressure, expectation coming from the fans, as well as the Waters camp. Although he says that the absence of himself on this album, and Wright, is the reason why he feels, quote, ever so slightly removed from A Momentary Lapse of Reason, to the point that it doesn't always sound like us. Damn right. Now, if we think about the 2019 remix, this is an excavated Floyd album as far as I'm concerned. I didn't care much for the original album, but this sounds much, much better. You get that languid drumming style of Nick Mason that's all over it now, because he did record the drum parts apparently, but they just didn't use them. Or did he re-record them? I can't remember. And they've nicked various keyboard parts from Richard Wright's live performances and interspersed, melded that into the final mix. So it has, it certainly achieved that timeless Floyd quality as far as I'm concerned. No, this album isn't going to make my top 10 Pink Floyd albums, but it's certainly not a bad album now, I think. Anyway, you've been watching a video by Classic Album Review. Please comment below if you agree or don't agree. Click like, share this video, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. I shall leave you with my closing salvo, which is, hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.